Час 15-го екуменічного соціального тижня за участі науковців, експертів, журналістів, духовенства ми обговоримо різноманітні аспекти ідентичності людини, нації, громади, особливості її становлення та переосмислення. Реєстрація та деталі на сайті esweek.org.ua. Форум відбувається у гібридному форматі.
Інститут екуменічних студій Українського католицького університету у співпраці із фондом Конрада-Аденауера за підтримки Євангелічної церкви Німеччини та участі Екуменічного інституту католицького університету в Парижі запрошують до участі у міжнародному суспільному форумі.
З 3 по 7 жовтня 15-й екуменічний соціальний тиждень «Мандрівна ідентичність. Осмислення сенсів та цінностей».
Війна в Україні ставить перед нами важливі питання. Хто ми? Куди ми йдемо? У що ми віримо? Якою мовою ми спілкуємося? Яка наша культурна, національна, релігійна, політична ідентичність?
Під час 15-го екуменічного соціального тижня за участі науковців, експертів, журналістів, духовенства ми обговоримо різноманітні аспекти ідентичності людини, нації, громади, особливості її становлення та переосмислення. Реєстрація та деталі на сайті esweek.org.ua. Форум відбувається у гібридному форматі.
Інститут екуменічних студій Українського католицького університету у співпраці із фондом Конрада-Аденауера за підтримки Євангелічної церкви Німеччини та участі Екуменічного інституту католицького університету в Парижі запрошують до участі у міжнародному суспільному форумі.
З 3 по 7 жовтня 15-й екуменічний соціальний тиждень «Мандрівна ідентичність. Осмислення сенсів та цінностей».
Війна в Україні ставить перед нами важливі питання. Хто ми? Куди ми йдемо? У що ми віримо? Якою мовою ми спілкуємося? Яка наша культурна, національна, релігійна, політична ідентичність?
Під час 15-го екуменічного соціального тижня за участі науковців, експертів, журналістів, духовенства ми обговоримо різноманітні аспекти ідентичності людини, нації, громади, особливості її становлення та переосмислення. Реєстрація та деталі на сайті esweek.org.ua. Форум відбувається у гібридному форматі.
Інститут екуменічних студій Українського католицького університету у співпраці із фондом Конрада-Аденауера за підтримки Євангелічної церкви Німеччини та участі Екуменічного інституту католицького університету в Парижі запрошують до участі у міжнародному суспільному форумі.
З 3 по 7 жовтня 15-й екуменічний соціальний тиждень «Мандрівна ідентичність. Осмислення сенсів та цінностей».
Війна в Україні ставить перед нами важливі питання. Хто ми? Куди ми йдемо? У що ми віримо? Якою мовою ми спілкуємося? Яка наша культурна, національна, релігійна, політична ідентичність?
Під час 15-го екуменічного соціального тижня за участі науковців, експертів, журналістів, духовенства ми обговоримо різноманітні аспекти ідентичності людини, нації, громади, особливості її становлення та переосмислення. Реєстрація та деталі на сайті esweek.org.ua. Форум відбувається у гібридному форматі.
Інститут екуменічних студій Українського католицького університету
Ще скажіть мені, яка є назва цієї конференції? Загальна.
Європейська та українська.
Ні, а загальна.
Загальна ідентичність, мандрівна.
Все, бо я читав, та все добре. Що це страшно дуже.
Є? Все, бажаю, що є.
Раз, два, три, чотири, п'ять. Є звук перекладачів?
Я був, бажаю, що є.
1, 2, 3. Так, звук провіряємо. Богу дякувати. Дуже добре. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 1. Виключайте ролик спочатку, правда?
Треба перевірити якість звуку, ні? Добре так, не заголосно.
У співпраці із фондом Конрада-Аденауера за підтримки Євангелічної церкви Німеччини та участі Екуменічного інституту католицького університету в Парижі запрошують до участі у міжнародному суспільному форумі.
З 3 по 7 жовтня 15-й екуменічний соціальний тиждень «Мандрівна ідентичність. Осмислення сенсів та цінностей».
Війна в Україні ставить перед нами важливі питання: хто ми, куди ми йдемо, у що ми віримо, якою мовою ми спілкуємося, яка наша культурна, національна, релігійна, політична ідентичність.
Під час 15-го екуменічного соціального тижня за участі науковців, експертів, журналістів, духовенства ми обговоримо різноманітні аспекти ідентичності людини, нації, громади, особливості її становлення та переосмислення. Реєстрація та деталі на сайті esweek.org.ua. Форум відбувається у гібридному форматі.
Інститут екуменічних студій Українського католицького університету у співпраці із фондом Конрада-Аденауера за підтримки Євангелічної церкви Німеччини та участі Екуменічного інституту католицького університету в Парижі запрошують до участі у міжнародному суспільному форумі.
З 3 по 7 жовтня 15-й екуменічний соціальний тиждень «Мандрівна ідентичність. Осмислення сенсів та цінностей».
Війна в Україні ставить перед нами важливі питання: хто ми, куди ми йдемо, у що ми віримо, якою мовою ми спілкуємося, яка наша культурна, національна, релігійна, політична ідентичність.
Під час 15-го екуменічного соціального тижня за участі науковців, експертів, журналістів, духовенства ми обговоримо різноманітні аспекти ідентичності людини, нації, громади, особливості її становлення та переосмислення. Реєстрація та деталі на сайті esweek.org.ua. Форум відбувається у гібридному форматі.
Слава Ісусу Христу! Доброго дня! Мене звати отець Роман Фігас, і від імені Інституту екуменічних студій радий вас запросити на нашу сьогоднішню онлайн-дискусію під назвою «Європейська та українська ідентичність. Хто ми?». Сьогоднішній захід відбувається в межах 15-го екуменічного соціального тижня, який ми назвали «Мандрівна ідентичність. Осмислення сенсів та цінностей». Цей 15-й ювілейний екуменічний соціальний тиждень відбувається за підтримки фонду Конрада-Аденауера в Україні та за підтримки Євангельської церкви в Німеччині. Сьогоднішній захід буде модерувати пан доктор Юрій Підлісний. Він є завідувач кафедри політичних наук, керівник програми «Етика, політика і економіка» Українського католицького університету. Пане Юрій, прошу.
Доброго дня, слава Ісусу Христу. У французькій мові є вислів «noblesse oblige» – «шляхетність зобов'язує». І цей вислів говорить про те, що твоя ідентичність, як приналежність до шляхетського роду, передбачає, що ти якимось чином будеш себе поводити в суспільстві, вдома, в політиці, в побуті. Ідентичність визначає те, як ти мав би себе поводити. І з іншого боку, те, як ти себе поводиш, визначає твою ідентичність. Тривалий час Україна була неприязно сприйнята в європейських політичних колах. Дуже часто Україну тримали поза європейським домом. В даному випадку я говорю про Європейський Союз. У мене є запитання до усіх панелістів. Що було причиною того, що нас не запрошували до Європейського Союзу? Лише тепер ми отримали кандидатство в члени Європейського Союзу. А що було причиною того, що Україна була на відстані? Корупція, реальполітик чи українська інакша ідентичність, ніж європейська?
Як ми працюємо? По черзі, до кого звертаєтеся? Чи може ви почнете? Would you please start?
I'm sorry, I'm not getting any translation, so I'm really sorry. This is not working, and I haven't understood any.
I will translate my question. In French language exists an expression, noblesse oblige, nobility oblige.
Yeah.
That means that if you are identified as belonging to nobility, it is presupposed that your behavior in politics, at home, on your work will be corresponding to this idea of nobility. Ukraine, during the long period of time, was held at the distance from the European Union. Only recently, Ukraine got an invitation to become a candidate to the membership. Why this situation changed? Why we were not welcomed to the European Union earlier? Was it the problem of corruption? Was it the problem of the so-called realpolitik? Or we have different identities?
Would you start?
Well, yes, well, let me try to address that. First, I have to say I'm not sufficiently knowledgeable about what goes on inside the European Commission to give a fully accurate account. But some things can be said, and I think that in this case, one shouldn't emphasize too much cultural identity and difference, because a similar situation arose around about 2002, well, 20 years ago already. It's hard to imagine, it's been so long ago, when the issue of Turkish membership arose. And in fact, I was quite involved in those debates at that time, and the prospect really did exist that Turkey might become a member of the European Union. That's not likely now. But I think the really interesting thing, I'm trying to answer your question in a slightly roundabout way, is that in the case of Turkey, where, yeah, sure, the cultural differences are large, certainly much larger than what might be a difference between Ukraine and, let's just say, Western Europe. But that actually wasn't really an issue. The fundamental issue about the enlargement of the European Union to include Turkey was quite literally the size of the country, and that would presumably pertain to Ukraine. And you have to remember that the enlargement of the European Union to take in the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, with the exception of Poland, they were all very, very small countries. And Poland, in relation to Ukraine, I suppose, is a small country. But so the enlargement process was never designed to be even what became. So I think that's one fact, the size of the country, and also another similarity with Turkey, a very large agricultural economy that presents all kinds of problems with European integration, with the agrarian economy and all of that. So those would be two quite more, shall we say, structural reasons than cultural reasons. Yes, definitely the issue of corruption was there, and probably true, especially since 2014, the whole question about disputed borders and all of that, that the countries that were incorporated into the European Union were ones that were, relatively speaking, stable. So I would want to emphasize those kind of reasons, the more structural, institutional ones, than cultural. Because after all, Ukraine is, in its cultural, its cultural history, as close to the core, so-called, I don't like to use the word, but let's just call it for the sake of argument, the core European countries, as the countries that were incorporated, like Bulgaria and Romania. So, I guess I'm not emphasizing cultural identity so much in this case, but it's a change now, certainly since the Russian invasion and this terrible war. Any question about cultural identity has faded. So, and maybe the last thing I will say is that anyway, the cultural differences in Europe are quite large between not just East and West, but also North and South. Going back, maybe I'm going on too much if I just tell me to stop. In the 1980s, there was a lot of talk about whether Spain and Portugal and Greece could be incorporated in, because they had just emerged out of dictatorships. And the view at the time was that it would be very difficult to incorporate these countries. But, they made the transition to democracy pretty quickly. In Spain after 1981, made a very swift transition to democracy. In Portugal after 1979, perhaps since the crisis of the euro currency, then that revived that difference between North and South, especially with Greece. So I don't think cultural identity is really at the fore. That would be my argument.
Thank you.
Я якраз буду про культурну ідентичність, те, що пан професор відклав на другий план. Я вернуся до того, що ви сказали на самому початку, пане Юрію, що ідентичність визначає поведінку, поведінка визначає ідентичність. Для мене більш важлива і друга частина тої формули, що поведінка визначає ідентичність, тому що ідентичність змінюється чому? Тому що змінюються обставини. Раз обставини змінюються ідентичності, хоча формально не залишається та сама. Якщо йти про поведінку, тут входить в гру історія. Я почну з тої тези, що скажу таке, що європейська ідентичність, українська ідентичність історично дуже сильно пов'язана з собою, тому що українська ідентичність – результатом європеїзації цього простору. Чи інакше кажуть «Rise of the West» – піднесення Європи. Європа, яка колись дуже малим, бідним провінційним континентом з кінця 15 століття починає приходити до глобального статусу, і в мирі того, як вона приходить на ці землі, оця колишній руський простір православний перетворюється в Україну. Це між собою дуже сильно пов'язано. Тобто українська генетично з європейською пов'язана, бо навіть неї залежить. Тільки, очевидно, це знають тільки, може, історики, гуманітарії, а не така загальна знання, тим менше про це знають політики. В цьому контексті дуже важливо є оцей поділ Захід-Схід. Україна є східна, вона є Східна Європа, і до неї стосуються критерії так званого орієнталізму. Нібито не європейці, але не цілком європейці. Якісь ніби не такі європейці, недоєвропейці, ще досконалі. Хочу вам сказати, що цей дискурс щодо того, що не треба приймати там окремі країни до Євроунії, стосувався не тільки України, чи навіть Болгарії, Румунії, але стосовно Польщі і Естонії в 90-х роках. Тому що вважалося, що Польща і Естонія не є достатньо європейські і що їм не вдасться. Зокрема, це дуже поширений стереотип німецький, так званий «Polnische Wirtschaft», що поляки ніколи не можуть брати ладу з господаркою, прийняття Польщі в Європейську Унію буде катастрофа і таке всі інше. Це мало прагматичні моменти, але ці прагматичні моменти були через історію через ці історичні стереотипи. Україна була особливою жертвою орієнталізму ще з тої причини, що Україна була не видна, бо Україна дивилася виключно в критеріях російської історії і культури. Вона була там захована. Особливо після війни українці були винятково ізольовані. Знаєте, як писав Норман Девіс, що про українців говорили тільки тоді, коли вони зробили щось погане, а коли вони робили щось добре, їх автоматично зараховували до росіян. Тому українці були, знаєте, нація селянська, неосвічена, антисеміти, такі всі інші речі, це має дуже сильно ці наслідки. Тому вона була неповноцінним. Дуже ми такі, знаєте, нібито європейці, але такі якісь дуже погані європейці. Я це дуже добре відчув, коли були дискусії в 90-х і нових роках, коли йшлося про розширення Європейського Союзу. Нам ці аргументи часто давали.
When I was participating in the discussions during the 1990s, sometimes very tangibly, sometimes not, and very often I would be told that you are not Europeans because you didn't undergo 1968 and you didn't undergo 1979. So these similar arguments that Ukraine did not undergo a change were sometimes spoken illicitly and sometimes in the face. This has been radically changed during the last 6 months. I don't know if there is any serious intellectual or politician who would dare to repeat these arguments that I heard in 1990s. Maybe somewhere in the corridors, in some unheard discussions, but in public, I cannot imagine this. What happened? War changed everything. War changed, and now Ukrainians cannot be doubted as Europeans. Now Ukrainians even look more Europeans than Europeans themselves. In 2013, 2014, during the Euromaidan, I remember there was an address from the European intellectuals, and they said that Ukraine is the best Europe one can imagine. And that's why, for me, it is not a question whether Ukrainians are Europeans. My question is, what can Ukrainians do to make sure that our contribution into this identity, or maybe not even contribution, it's a bad word to say, what can we do to make sure that this Ukrainian identity flows into this European identity and change it? I would say in a very incorrect way. And please excuse me, I had an interview with one American director, and he said, sorry, I didn't hear. Ukrainian identity is now putting on the agenda the question of European identity in a way that was never questioned before. Now we have an online panelist joining our discussion.
До слова запрошую Олів'є Абеля, який приєднує...
Olivier Abel is joining us online. You are welcome.
Включіть, будь ласка.
Bonjour. Ah, je vois que ma vidéo ne marche pas, d'accord. Merci, hein, je suis désolé d'être arrivé un peu en retard.
It's a pity that I am a little bit late and that I do not have video. I have been teaching history for a long time in Turkey, and these questions pertain to the circle of my interests, and the question of European borders and European identity has been always in the center of my attention. Those were quite tough debates in Turkey, because in 1990s, those were the questions that are very significant and they're very emotional. And now questions about changing borders are relevant to all of us. Very often, the questions themselves are very complicated. We are following the events in Ukraine. And Europe is now experiencing very significant changes. And times. I have been interacting with intellectuals from China and also with a French guy, with a French historian. We raised issues of global importance, and we understood that even the word capitalism itself has to be reassessed. We are talking about morality in society. Can we reassess the notion of morality in capitalist society? Identity in Europe is about ethics, about plurality. And to be a European, to be part of Europe, means to accept a lot of other traditions. It's a society, it's a community where different traditions interact. It's also the question of languages. It's an ability to see the world and to look at the world through the plurality. All this is very significant for philosophical formulas, and I also believe it is important that there is a lot of lack of knowledge from history, from the side of history. Europe consists of the countries that used to be Protestant, that used to be Latin linguistically. And it is important to understand now this plurality. This is quite an unfinished circle. Everything is being under construction all the time. And we can see that Europe is also facing some threats. It's a threat of identity, because we can speak about some termination of nationalism when someone says that he is a European. It's also a cultural vacuum. It's also a certain level of skepticism. It's also engagement with too many economical projects. It's a lot of discussions, but the society, the community cannot be constructed around vacuum. There should be some identity. And what else would I like to add, because I'm very sensitive to all these issues? I remember one Russian thinker who said that countries of the Eastern Europe are faced with a very serious challenge, and I think it was last summer, if I'm not mistaken. I saw a friend in Turkey who runs a big enterprise, and he said that everything that he sees around are nothing but traces of certain mafia. We can speak about political norms, about democracy. There is some echo. And this is huge threat, because this touches the very heart of our shared project which we call Europe. It has changed a little bit recently. Mr. Yaroslav HRYTSAK mentioned that we can hardly find a politician today who would say that Ukraine is not Europe. Moreover, many European politicians are saying now that not every EU member would be ready to stand with firearms in his hands and die for the European ideas and values, just the way the Ukrainians are doing it now. We have been invited to the European Union, The last sociological survey showed that 86% of Ukrainians are for Ukraine entering EU, and 83% vote for Ukraine being in NATO. So the revolution of dignity, this phase of war, the second phase of war, fully fledged war, changed our identity, or have these events changed the European perception of Ukrainians? A good question. Mr. Olivier would like to answer first.
Who will be the first one? Maybe Yaroslav, you start. What you have already said demonstrates an important change, and I would like to emphasize that this change, 83% pertains to all age groups and all regions without any conclusion, including the east and the south of our country. So basically, these are the regions that are deemed Russian ones by Putin. Adam Nitin said one important statement. He is a famous ideologist of the Polish solidarity, and he said once that the European future will be determined not by Lviv or Kyiv, but Odessa and Kharkiv. So when Odessa and Kharkiv start siding with Europe, Ukraine will become European. And this is something that we are observing right now. And we can also see that Putin is bombarding Ukraine, the cities of Kharkiv and Odessa in the first place. And this way, he's basically decimating the Soviet identity of these cities and reinforcing their European identity. And it's a pragmatic choice because we do understand that Europe is a zone where the war between two neighboring countries is not possible. We can criticize Europe for many things, and there will be some hard feelings about this criticism, but there is one point beyond criticism. Europe is a zone of peace right now. And why are Ukrainians aspiring for this zone of peace? Because we don't want to find ourselves in a situation when we will be subjected to another assault. So what is special about the recent months, and whoever participated in the Maidan remembers that. And this is something that we heard from the veterans of the Polish solidarity movement. It's all about solidarity. It's all about empathy, something that cannot be translated into feelings, something that cannot be articulated in words, the sense of special dignity and immense love. And it's not just something pathetic or something to say for the sake of saying. So we have this spirit of solidarity encompassing the entire country of Ukraine. And that's why Ukraine is so beautiful right now. Of course, we are sustaining enormous losses. We have already paid a really high price. And unfortunately, this price will be even higher. We're not even sure about the final price that we will have to pay for it. But at the same time, I would like to draw your attention to the fact that this feeling that we have now, this is something very human, something profound. It's all about empathy, solidarity, love. It's all Ukrainian. I mean, if we want to shape a new European identity, it has to be about that. This has to be the essence of this new European identity. Olivier mentioned that one of the threats of European identity is relativism. Ukraine reminds everyone that there are certain things that are not relative. These are the things that you have to defend, that you have to fight for, that you have to be ready to die for. Ukraine is giving Europe a feeling that Europe lost a long time ago, the warmth of human relationships. And I think from this perspective, Ukraine has a lot to tell the world. I think it's one of the greatest gifts of ours that we need to share with the world. But the question is whether we know how to do that, whether we have the capacity to verbalize it. Because the fact that we have this feeling, this new identity, doesn't really mean that we will be able to translate it into words, because we need to cherish it, we need to espouse it, we need to organize conferences, we need to write books, you name it. But there's one important thing, and I will pause there. This is the statement of Marci Shor, my friend. She is a professor from Yale University. She wrote a fantastic book about the Maidan, but not Maidan as history, but Maidan as a phenomenon, because she specializes in the phenomenology of history. And she wrote one important statement that resonated with me. She said that postmodernism died on the Maidan. And she means that everything is relative, that there are no genuine things or true things, true words do not really exist. And that's why Putin's propaganda is so popular, because it's basically a postmodernism in its extreme form of absurdity. So there's no truth and everyone can lie. And if everyone lies, why can't we lie? So this is something that we need to keep in mind, because the issue of Ukraine's European identity is not just a pragmatic issue. There's something deeper, there's something more profound there. It's about the inner depths of our spiritual life. And it's not really the task of historians, but there are challenges for theologians here and philosophers. I believe that only these two sciences can reach into these depths. So the question is how these scholars will re-articulate these things. And I'm almost done. I'm very skeptical about theologians and philosophers will be able to do that. And I'm skeptical right now because I'm observing the analysis of this war by the Vatican and by the Pope. This is not something that we wanted to hear. So the Pope does not really have a feel for Ukraine. The Pope does not really have a feel for Ukraine as a special Christian experience. He's thinking in different terms. You know, we can fix something, we can patch it up. But once again, it's not really the depth that we want to reach out to. I think I will pause there. Thank you very much, Professor HRYTSAK. And now I would like to give the floor to Mr. Olivier ABEL.
Oui, c'est très important ce qui vient d'être dit. Hein.
Yes, what Professor HRYTSAK has just said is extremely important. The issue of solidarity is fundamental here. Solidarity has to lie in the heart of Europe. There's nothing I can add from a theological perspective here. Everything that gospel can offer is along the following lines. We need to offer mercy. This is something that Jesus Christ was talking about, and mercy is not something theoretical. Mercy is also part and parcel of this solidarity. It's a broad phenomenon. It's something amazing. I fully agree. I also think that Europe is not in its best position right now. There is a lot of poverty. For some civilizations, the phenomenon of poverty is just fine. But in Europe, we have this solidarity that is deeply steeped in all aspects of European life. It's not about defending postmodernism. Jan Potočka, a Czech philosopher that suffered at the hand of the police, and that's why he died, wrote that Europe is all about being hesitant. It's all about questioning. Anyone can go out to a Maidan, take to the streets and ask a question. It's a political gesture, it's a diplomatic gesture. And this is something that lies in the core of Europe. In Istanbul, there were some similar events of rebellion. Unfortunately, that crowd was dispersed in an aggressive manner. But at the same time, we also need to keep in mind certain risks that exist. I don't really know who Europeans are, but they have this selfish or hypocritical desire to say, we are Democrats and you are not really Democrats. We can cooperate with those that are relatively democratic. But these non-democrats serve in the capacity of this sort of shield that can protect us. We accuse them, but at the same time, we use them as a shield. I think it's a manifestation of hypocrisy, and it's terrible. It's this old European politics that tolerates this behavior and tolerates this approach. But there is one danger here. The ones that are protecting us now can become our adversaries. They can turn against us. They don't really have to maintain this front line. I think that all European countries, including provincial ones, are within and outside of Europe, if I can put it this way. So we are within and outside at the same time. Maybe it sounds a little bit abstract and philosophical, but what is happening to us right now is quite commonplace. So we are either part of this closed or open society. Either we accept and tolerate openness, but at the same time, we need to reach consensus between whatever is inside and outside, within and outside. In France, there are certain regions that are not European at all, but maybe they will become European over time. I believe that Ukraine is the most European region in Europe right now, but Europe is not something static. It's dynamic and it is evolving. Ukraine is pro-European, and hence the enormous changes that we have been observing recently. Europe can reject at times, it can humiliate, it can create some hard feelings. So I can totally relate to this feeling of humiliation that some of you might have. So this is the dynamics that we should track down. But whatever is being built in Eastern Europe right now is about building new borders. And I'm not really talking about state borders or national borders. It's not a national war. We need to craft a new formula for borders.
Ça sera reparti pour un tour à la génération prochaine.
Dziękuję, Olivier Abel.
Otherwise, the future generations will have to do that.
Yes, thank you. Can I just begin with making a comment on your comments? Sorry, I'm hearing myself here. Take it off for a moment. Well, I agree with everything you said, except one point which I would want to qualify, so we shouldn't be just agreeing with each other all the time. Concerning postmodernism, I don't normally want to go and defend postmodernism, but on this point, I think I probably have to. Let's not forget that postmodernism as a philosophical movement was a critical movement, and I think it's not quite the same. The emphasis in it on relativism has to be seen as a critique of old universalistic ideas that became discredited. So I would want to make a distinction between postmodernism and so-called post-truth, and I don't see the regime in the Kremlin as the embodiment of postmodernism, but of something far worse. Perhaps a small pedantic point on maybe how we use the term postmodernism, but maybe going back to the question more specifically, Yeah, I think it's clear there's a transformation in Ukrainian national collective identity, and something like that is going on in the rest of Europe, partly because of the Ukraine issue, but especially as a sociologist looking at these things, there's one point I would want to emphasize, and it's really the main point I want to make, is for a crisis to be transformational. There are always crises of different kinds going on, but for a crisis to be really transformational, a number of things have to intersect. So we have, from the perspective of Europe as a whole, we have a number of crises intersecting with each other. There's the Russian invasion and everything that implies, but there's also the wider ecological or environmental question that's bound up with the situation in relation to Russia and energy supplies. And there's the food crisis that's also a global crisis. And, well, there's a crisis of democracy. There's a far-right government, not just in the Kremlin, but also now in Italy. And the far-right have been elected to the government of Sweden. It's quite an extraordinary development. And who knows what will go on in France in the next presidential election there. So democracy is also in crisis. And there's more generally an economic crisis. So I think, looking at it from a sociological perspective, it's the intersection of crises that will determine what will happen in the future. And a crisis reaches a point of resolution or of going backwards. And of course, we don't know what the outcome will be. We can hope it will be a positive one. But a lot, I think, depends on how the different crises interact and what comes out of those interactions. And maybe just one final point.
Професор Грицак хотів відреагувати.
Я згоджуся з вашою критикою. Я годюся з вашою критикою пістолово, але
There's a response from Professor HRYTSAK. I agree with your criticisms, but I would like to explain what I meant. The idea of Europe is the idea of perpetual crisis. So Europe is all about crisis. But what I like about Europe is that each and every crisis leads to a specific resolution. And this is the resolution that has not only the European importance, but also global importance. And this is something that we need to factor in. Crisis, identity, there is an overlap between the two. And that's why I gravitate towards Europe. As for postmodernism, well, maybe it's a banal statement, but postmodernism arose as a result of crisis, post-war crisis, the crisis of these grand narratives that we are familiar with. I think you understand what I'm talking about. But at the same time that Europe is experiencing new crisis right now, and postmodernism is not really there anymore. I mean, the challenges are different because we have this extreme condition because of specific politicians. Well, the statement about Putin's regime as postmodernist is not my statement. It's a statement by Peter Pomerantsev, a British journalist and publicist, and he worked in Moscow on TV for 8 years. And at that time, Putin's regime was not really an authoritarian regime. It was this ideal postmodernist regime because any grand narrative was not possible. And if grand narrative is not possible, if the truth is some sort of construct, so the truth does not really exist. What was our Maidan about? The Maidan demonstrated a new reality. There are certain things that you should sacrifice your life for. It's not really a philosophical question, it's an ontological question, because there's not a big difference between the image and the reality. So what was happening on the Maidan? And my friend from Yale University said that it was a radical breakthrough. You might remember this young girl that was a nurse on the Maidan. She was shot down, and she wrote on Twitter, "I'm dying." And what she wrote was this breakthrough, because there was no line anymore between the image, what was happening on the Maidan, and reality. And this is something that we can see in battle areas right now, on the front line right now. So my question is whether we can transmit this experience to everyone else. It's not that Ukrainians are unique, but the crisis that we are experiencing right now is unique. Thank you very much. I would like to add something to your last statement. We have epistemological and ontological dimensions here as well. So there's some sort of identity that is normative, and this is the identity that we should strive for. Is there some sort of European identity that is a norm? It's obvious that on the one hand, identity is static, it's also dynamic at the same time, but is there the core of the European identity that we should be striving for? And if there are some European countries that are rejecting this European identity, should we try and influence them to have them back? Or maybe the European identity is rethinking and recreating itself. What is the order? Who should be the first one?
Thank you. Yes, well, first of all, I would want to say that one should not emphasize, push too far philosophy of Europeanization, work, that's come out of the writings of, amongst others, Habermas, Jürgen Habermas, or many political philosophers of European integration. There are two things that come across immediately. I guess I need to think a little bit more, but two ideas. One, which I talked about yesterday in my short talk, the normative value of peace, and I've emphasized that European integration from the beginning was a peace project. I know that needs to be qualified in many ways, but that's one. And secondly, another normative value that's very much emphasized in the political philosophical literature is the rights of the individual. I think there's maybe consensus is too strong, but there seems to be some consensus that the European Union is, from a constitutional point of view, as a constitutional space based on the rights of the individual. So the individual does seem to be, from a legal political point of view, the normative core of Europe. So I think these sorts of things should be emphasized, and I would follow, as I always do, the footsteps of Habermas, and stress that political identity in contemporary societies, which are multifaceted and large-scale, built up of many different elements, needs to be minimal. It can't be based on strong cultural identities, and so that the common ground can really work only if it is limited to broadly constitutional principles. So I would want to emphasize these two, and perhaps if I thought a little bit more about it, one might want to build in here democracy. Of course, raises the question of what does that actually really mean.
Дякую. Пане Олів'є Абель, будь ласка, вам слово.
Mr. Olivier Abel, the floor is yours.
Oui, vous m'entendez? Très bien, merci. Oui, ce sont des questions qui m'intéressent beaucoup. J'étais un grand ami de Jean-François Lyotard.
These are the questions that I'm really interested in. And I would like to quote Jean-François Lyotard, who wrote a very significant book in which he stated that whenever we are talking about the questions of development, accumulation of competences, enhancement, if we talk about the competition or efficiency, we will eventually end up in one word. But we will not say that all this is positive when we are speaking about some conditional development. And this word that I meant is identity. But what has changed in all these contemporary narratives? And we can see how Putin manipulates this. It's the feeling of hate, the feeling of dignity. It's a feeling when one wants urgently to protect themselves. And we are experiencing a kind of rewriting of reality, a rewriting of history. And this national resistance is helping people in Ukraine.
Mais aussi de réouvrir les intentions.
And as contemporary times show us how significant it is to underline one's identity, to be able to protect one's identity. This is a reopening of Europe, or opening of Europe itself in its essence. If we are talking about a constitutional aspect, about ecumenical movement, when we remember different epochs, Renaissance, Baroque, Middle Ages, we can see that we will be going down the vertical where we will find some bright people always leading to great changes. And even in contemporary world, we can see this renovation, this renewal with different motivation, with different kinds of support. But above all, we can state that Ukraine is in the middle of the project that is making the history of Europe happen. Ukraine is the heart of contemporary Europe. And now everything has to be reassessed. We, as philosophers, as thinkers, we have to think about this. And I can speak now about a grand narrative that is awaiting us. I am a little bit afraid of normative identity, such notion, because I don't know what is normative identity. Then how are we going to measure the normality of this identity, of this normative identity, and how shall we deal with people who are not fitting this normative identity? This is a little bit dangerous notion. I'm speaking as a historian, because sometimes we forget that an identity is something that is constantly changing. In the 20th and 30th years of the last century, the best identities were expressed by Hitler and Mussolini, which sounds quite strange for us. But Hitler was promoting the idea of creating new Europe, and there are certain works written that are proving that institutionally Europe owes a lot to them. This is a very discussive idea, but of course the idea of Europe produced by Hitler or Macron or Olaf or Scholz, these are different ideas. But we understand that these ideas are changing depending on the circumstances, and we again face this statement that circumstances face our identity and not identity faces circumstances. For me, this European identity, I would not speak about European identity. I would speak rather about the values that are laid in its foundation, not the values that are being proclaimed that we are for everything good and against everything evil. But this is something for what we are ready to sacrifice, including sacrificing our lives. Starting with our salaries, what are the values that we are able to sacrifice for everything, starting from our salaries and finishing even with our life? What makes the sense of our life? For me as a historian, what is the peculiarity of Europe is a constant permanent crisis. But one of the biggest solutions of crisis is this European project of modernization, or the project of modernity. This is an absolutely European project, although many people will say that it's not true, but I agree that Europe has invented this formula of modernity. This is a European formula. It's called sustainable development. I think there was a conference even dedicated to this sustainable development. What is that? Sustainable development means that that's something that economists have calculated, that every 5 years you have one more or less bad year and 4 good years. So 4 years are good, then there is 1 year of catastrophes, crisis, and then we go back to the prosperous 4 years. This is what is called a prosperous development. This is what is called sustainable development. This is what historians traced for 200 years. This project was very tightly connected with, first of all, Christianity, and secondly, Christianity has one very significant idea. That's the idea of dignity and freedom. And the Ukrainian formula of sustainable development shows that you cannot have sustainable, good political and economic development if you do not provide for a political freedom of your citizens. Because now this formula of success spread worldwide and became global. But now we are facing a challenge that some countries are refusing from this formula. Putin says, I don't like this formula. We don't want to give political freedoms to people. We will go our own way. And this idea of their own way, creating something alternative, or the conception of Brexit, or regulated democracy, this is the term coined by Putin, sovereign democracy. This is an attempt to create an alternative concept that we can buy political freedom by political slavery, by means of political slavery. That political slavery can be justified, can justify economical prosperity. That Europe was always conquering lands, spreading colonies, and this was the European formula of success, this hypocrisy. This is the statement that Putin communicates to us. But we know that economical freedom is not possible, is inalienable without the rights of humans, of citizens, because all these talks that there is some other special alternative way, it sounds as if there is a special race of people who like when they are sent to prison or when they are sent to front line to die for somebody's ideas, or somebody's daughters are being raped because their handkerchiefs are not worn in the proper way. But human beings are very simple. Human beings want to satisfy their personal needs of love, being loved, of a need of security. And for me, this European formula and the Ukrainian experience are very important. And so Russia says that Ukraine is not European. And there are countries that can be geographically beside Europe, be not European. For me, a very interesting country is Mongolia, Southern Korea. Just look how they behaved during the Russian crisis. They behaved as Europeans. So for me, European is not attached to some geopolitical location. I may sound as an utopian, but I think the task of Europe is to disappear, to get dissolved, to make believe that this European formula becomes so global that it is not European anymore. It's everywhere. I believe that Europe has to expand. It's the duty of Europe to expand. And I believe that a huge mistake was non-desire of EU to accept Turkey. This is what we are now paying the price for. We wouldn't have Erdogan today. We wouldn't have today's situation, and we wouldn't have Russia as we have it now. I believe that the most natural way to expand for Europe is Ukraine, and the next should be Belarus. I don't know where should Europe expand further, but this is the project that should be forwarded and should be dynamically forwarded. because it's a very dynamic thing. Going back to Ukraine, why is Ukraine so significant? Because it gives a second breath to this project, because it shows that there is a territory that is not fully frigidly European, but it behaves European. So if this country can, why not other countries? Why should not other countries be not able? So there are no some special peculiarities, but you have to do some work. You have to do some reform. Thank you, Mr. HRYTSAK. We have almost reached a consensus that that normativity in sense of ideology or doctrine does not exist, but normativity should be based on values, and these values form a certain formula of identity. Those who confess certain values are ready even to die for these values, and they form this value. The word value is quite new in Latin. In Latin, they used bonum, which is good. Bon diffusium sui, the good wants to spread itself. And we can see how these values spread to other continents, created other civilizations like America and Australia. Now you have given an example, a set of examples of other countries who are far away from Europe, but who behave in a European way. Let me turn our discussion from this academic or academic popular discussion into a completely popular sphere. While traveling around European countries and watching their TV shows, you can see how simple people, let's take France, they say that there in Europe, and some arguments begin, or certain sentences in Italy, there in Europe. How can you explain that the citizens of the country who belong to the heart of the EU talk about there in Europe as if they are not belonging to that Europe? There is some normativity out there, but we have not achieved this normativity. Professor HRYTSAK, we will start from you. There was once a good site that was called In Search of Eastern Europe. The certain guy was traveling around cities that belonged to Central Europe, but these cities are the cities of the countries that do not belong to EU. It's the cities between Black Sea and the Baltic Sea. These cities also are in Ukraine. Some of them are in Ukraine. So the question is, it's a very significant and funny statement that the biggest Europeans are the ones who are not in Europe because they want to be in Europe. The stronger is the desire. The bigger you are a European. This is very nicely described by dissidents who left the Soviet Union and went to live to Paris or London. I remember these memories from Mr. Pomerantsev, the elder. He said that he felt European when he was in the Soviet Union, then when he arrived to Paris and lived there. So this is a wandering identity. Its identity is being constantly constructed. It's wandering. It's not stable. Can we have some solution to this? For me, of course, geography doesn't matter here. Europe is not about geographical location. Before coming here, I was watching how a European and national identity coexist in different countries, and I was watching sociological survey. Probably you know Pew, it's a huge consortium, and they conduct different surveys, and the last one was about European identity. And what they show is there is no strict division between EU and national identity. Sometimes people believe that they are French, sometimes people believe that they're Europeans, and the biggest group, if we take, let's say, France, they believe that they are both French and EU. A national identity is always stronger than EU identity, but this is very funny that European identity is more tangible in the East than in the West. But that's because they are in the middle, in the epicenter of European identity. They do not associate themselves so much with identity. But you know, there is this division between ethnical nationalism and political nationalism. Who is more a Ukrainian? Someone who speaks Ukrainian language or someone who is loyal to the Ukrainian state? Theorists say that this dichotomy does not work. It works only with huge groups when somebody says this should be this way or that way. No, it's not either. It's the idea of both. To simply say how the civil identity is built around the ethnic identity. So both are present. I think that national identity should be built, European identity should be strong. But European identity should be built around national identity, and national identity should be circulating in a very strong European context. I will share his feeling of historian. Europe is missing a shared historical narrative, not just a set of facts about the past of the Europe, but as a certain narration why Europe is the way it is and what it means. And how are we Europeans and Indo-Europeans? I have an assumption, maybe contemporary crisis, this current crisis will again put this question on agenda, and maybe we will create this shared common narrative. And as a Ukrainian historian, I'm saying that maybe Ukrainian historians can make their contribution into creating of this narration. Thank you very much. Now,
to your question is to see this question of, you know, what is Europe and what it's not, and, you know, why people, as you said, you know, imagined or say Europe is not here, it's there, or they're going to Europe and all of that, that Europe is an imaginary construction. It's not something real in the sense of something that exists outside the language and discourse in which it is described. But that's true of nations, that the same can be said about a nation. You know, going back to the famous book by Benedict Anderson that's quoted so often of imaginary communities. I think it applies both to the category of the nation and to the category of Europe. So there's no reality that is outside that construction. I think that must be the answer to it. And you know, if you travel to a country, you want to know, like I traveled yesterday by train from Poland to Lviv, and I was asking myself at one point, have I crossed into Ukraine? But there's no real marker. Maybe there's a border somewhere, but which I didn't detect, but the countryside doesn't change. So it's ultimately in the imagination. Maybe that's not the best example, but you know, a better example might be the border between some of the Schengen countries in Europe. When you pass through them, you don't notice anything. There's no marker between one of the borders between France and Spain in the Pyrenees, not even a sign indicating that you're moving from one to the other. And in fact, I once accidentally drove across the border without realizing I suddenly realized I was in France. But it's the imagination, I think, is the key to answering these things. They're imaginary constructions, and they can be therefore imagined in ever new ways.
Дякую, професоре Деланті.
Thank you very much, Professor Delanty, and now I would like to give the floor to Olivier ABEL.
Merci beaucoup. Oui, moi je pense quand même que d'une certaine manière l'Europe existe. beaucoup, de manière très.
I think that there are still certain criteria in Europe. They are quite contentious, but there's always this issue, European issue.
Toujours laisser la place, si je peux dire, au possible passage de l'hostilité à l'hospitalité.
It's also important to meet one another halfway in terms of hospitality, in terms of animosity. There has to be something innate, something inherent to have this capacity to meet one another halfway. There are certain things that are innate in me. This is something that I cannot change. I just do something that is integral to my culture. I don't really want to be too hospitable or too adversary to others. We have to be ready to die. This is not something that we change as a church. We cannot really change our identity like that. This is something fundamental for us. We don't really have a sufficient shared narrative. Right now, we are in the process of discovering an important conversation for ourselves. It's a philosophical, artistic, religious, literary. This is something that can be depicted in novels, but it's also a dimension of our imagination. These are the core questions that we need to ask ourselves. What is this image of good life? What am I concerned about in France? What is this real life? Of course, we all aspire to some sort of ideal life. Is it the image that we can see among thousands and thousands of political refugees that have settled down in France right now? Or maybe conversely, they are being subjected to enormous stress because of that. The ongoing war is accelerating certain processes, and we can see the limits of human beings. I believe that Europeans, the French society, the state of France should understand first and foremost what it means to be a dignified European, what it means to live a life of dignity. But I would like to veer back to this topic of hospitality and animosity. I referenced Turkey in one of my previous statements. I believe that there are about 2 to 3 million Syrian refugees in Turkey right now, and the Turkish society has to integrate them and cohabitate with them somehow. We can also mention hypocrisy or unhospitable reception of these refugees, but there are certain things that require a drastic transformation. What we are observing right now can serve as an impetus for everyone to make that effort, to make that attempt. We need to expand, we need to deepen these fundamental shared values that we have. We need to craft certain tools that could support our society. Thank you very much. I would like to revert back to our identity. One analytical center, one think tank in Europe had a meeting, and 2 statements from 2 leading EU politicians were voiced there. One of them said, "I'm Italian. I was brought up within Italian culture, and because I'm Italian, I'm also European." Another politician during the same meeting stated, "I feel very good in Athens, in Lisbon, in Paris, in Berlin. I am a European. And only later do I remember that I'm a German. What should this identity be for Ukraine? Are we Europeans and then later we remember that we are Ukrainians, or maybe we are Ukrainians and hence that's why we are Europeans? You should be the first one, Professor DELANTY.
Question, it's helpful to make some conceptual distinctions talking about identity. First, to begin with, we're only talking about identity relatively recently. I don't know, maybe 20 years or something. Until 20 years ago, people didn't talk about identity in the way in academic discourse and in the wider society. And it's interesting to note that this whole politics of identity arose first in left-wing discourse around multiculturalism and radical cultural politics, feminism, and so on. Whereas today, this discourse of identity has been taken over by the political and cultural right. And so we're left with this notion of identity, which is a problematical idea. So that's one point. Secondly, since we have this term identity, it's not going to go away, I think, so easily. It's helpful to approach it, at least logically, conceptually. Here, I think one has to distinguish between individual identities and collective ones, because the logic, the makeup of both are different. You know, your identity as a person, my identity, his identity is very different from the logic of collective identities. An individual identity is relatively strong because, you know, if it wasn't, you wouldn't know who you were. You would collapse. You would not be able to function. You have a memory, and that's made up of a narrative, a biography. It will, of course, change in time, and it begins, if we follow psychological arguments, with the child distinguishing themselves from the mother. Yeah, so personal identities are quite strong, and I think they necessarily have to be. You can argue how strong they should be, but collective identities are different. For them, let's say, for them to be healthy, let's talk about healthy identities without going into too much detail what is healthy and what is not. But for the sake of argument, a healthy collective identity, in my view, and I have made this point in previous remarks, cannot be or should not be too strong. And successful, shall we say, collective identities, healthy ones, societies that are relatively successful, or ones that do not have very strong collective identities. Take maybe the example of Canada, a favorite example, possibly the example of Switzerland, countries that learned, maybe Germany, at least in the days of the Federal Republic after the Second World War, learned to scale down its identity. So collective identities have or should have a greater capacity to be contradictory. And if individuals had contradictory identities, they might be problematical for them. So I would want to emphasize these different things and not mix up the language of individual with collective identities. So collective identities can have a greater capacity for contestation, for self-problematization, whereas you're not, I imagine, calling yourself into question every moment of the day. On the other hand, sometimes we do have to question our self-identity. They have a greater capacity to be porous, to overlap. So I think those conclusions would lead to a view that the relationship between a European identity and a national identity is something more overlapping, and it changes in time. It's not the case that there's a European identity up there and there's some kind of a hierarchy, but national identities are themselves Europeanized entities. When just take these, well, maybe just two examples, three examples: Spain, Germany today, and Ireland, I think, are examples of countries that have national identities that are highly Europeanized ones, as opposed to a position that sees the European level as somewhere above or outside. In that case, Britain might be an example, but here illustrating a different point. Undoubtedly, the dominant view in Britain is that the European aspect, or the European identity, is somewhere on top or outside the national identity. But that's the way people see things. But the reality is different. If you take a social indicators approach, you'll actually find that Britain is a much more Europeanized society than meets the eye, despite Brexit.
Дякую, професоре. Професор Олів'є Абель, будь ласка.
Thank you very much, Professor. Professor Olivier Abel, the floor is to you.
Не маємо зв'язку з професором.
Je vais être assez
There's
bref.
no sound.
La question pose la question de l'avant-tout. Avant tout, est-ce qu'on est ukrainien, français, italien?
Unfortunately, I cannot hear the Ukrainian interpretation, so I cannot interpret from Ukrainian into English.
Oui, vous m'entendez là?
Ми вас чуємо, так.
Voilà, je parle. Vous m'entendez?
Ну, oui.
Vous ne m'entendez pas?
Nous vous entendons très bien.
J'ai mon micro pourtant.
Okay, the sound is there, but unfortunately, I cannot hear the Ukrainian interpretation.
Vous ne m'entendez plus?
Ми вас добре чуємо. Продовжуйте, будь ласка.
D'accord, merci. Oui, oui, j'étais en train de dire que la question qui était posée, c'est la question de avant tout. Est-ce que avant tout je suis italien ou est-ce que je suis
The question was as follows: what goes first? Am I European first or am I Ukrainian first? I think it's a question of syntaxes. It all depends on what we put first. What is the determining factor in our priorities? Do we want to be Europeans before we become Ukrainians and Italians, or vice versa? There are always contexts, there are always situations when priorities change, when our understanding might be altered as well. I think that we can be both at the same time. And this is integral to the contemporary identity. We're not really talking about some exclusive identity. We're talking about plural identity. It can be enmeshed, it can be interwoven, it can be interconnected with other types of identities. I cannot really think just about myself. Usually I think of myself in the context of communication with others. Professor HRYTSAK? Mr. Professor said that there are different types of identities. You cannot really define identities. Well, we don't really know what time is, even though we use time. It's really difficult to define the concept of time. So we all want to understand who we are. Identities change. We all understand that. But at the same time, we also understand that identities are diverse because there are not only national identities, European identities. We can have an identity as a professor, as a husband, as a fan of the Karpaty football club in Lviv. So all these are also identities. But the question is how all these identities are part of some sort of hierarchy. It all changes over time, depending on the circumstances. But what is my point here? There are mutually exclusive identities, and there are also mutually reinforcing identities. Before the war in Galicia, it was the normative identity to be a Pole and a Ukrainian at the same time. Genteruteni Poloni. So that's what it was called. Ukrainians with some Polish roots, and they did not really separate these two identities. But then in 1918, after the Poland-Galicia War, this identity disappeared. So the Ukrainian and the Polish identities were separated. And this is something that we can see in Ukraine, because we had a large group of Ukrainians that identified themselves as Ukrainians and as Russians at the same time. But since the outbreak of the war, they had to side with one identity. So it all depends on the needs and circumstances. My formula is as follows. I believe that those identities are more sustainable, more palatable, and more successful that are inclusive and not exclusive. And from this perspective, the more diverse groups we can incorporate into this category, be it European or Ukrainian, the more viable this identity will be. In this regard, I don't really think that we need to have these mutually exclusive Ukrainian or European identities, Italian or European identities. So these two identities should coexist and interact with each other. I do remember that in the Soviet times, they tried to separate the Ukrainian and European identities because the discourse was based on the fact that Europe was a threat, because Napoleon was from Europe, Hitler was from Europe, capitalism is from Europe, so Ukraine has to be with Russia because this is the only way to protect it from Europe. So Europe was viewed as a threat, and this is something that Putin is doing right now. He views the West as a threat, but I don't really see the need there anymore. So I don't really see the need to separate the Ukrainian and European identities. And this is something that I mentioned before. We should have a look at sociology. The Germans, the French, the Italians view themselves as Italians, the French, the Germans, and also Europeans. And another important point, what is the biggest crisis right now? Where is this line that we are not ready to cross? Well, it's not really the red line, but this is basically like a sticking point or a tripping point when talking about our identity. It's the issue of homosexuality. Maybe it will not really sound that nice. This is the issue that is exploited by Putin, because Putin refers to Europe as the embodiment of homosexuality, but young Arabs and young Europeans share some values. But once again, there's this issue of women and the issue of homosexuality. I'm not promoting homosexuality, please get me right. But once again, how far can we go there? What is the line that we cannot really cross? Until recently, we would never think in Ukraine that a Jew could be part of Ukrainian family. So the Jews didn't really want to be friends with the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians didn't really want to be friends with the Jews, but it's not there anymore. The level of anti-Semitism is very low, with even one of the lowest ones in Ukraine right now, and we have a president who is a Jew. So the Ukrainian formula includes a lot of different identities. But once again, they should not really be hostile. They need to be complementary. Thank you very much, Professor. And my last question. And I would like everyone to squeeze their answers within 1 minute. We have some questions from our online audience. What should we do so that after the war, we will not lose our solidarity, because it was the case on multiple occasions in the past. So, Mr. HRYTSAK, we will start with you.
Навіть не сумнівайтеся. Тому що
Don't even doubt, because this will end up in war. The question is how much we shall lose. It's the question, not moral rather, but institutional. What institutions shall we be able to create? Which rules we shall be able to establish in order not to lose it? But I think the key task is to make a judicial reform. Then we will be able to sustain our solidarity. Professor Abel, 1 minute is yours.
Oui, vous m'entendez?
Oui, nous vous entendons.
Merci. Je sais pas. Alors, Emmanuel Kant, il disait une chose très forte, je crois.
Immanuel Kant said one powerful stuff about wars. In order to think about peace, you have to conduct war to enable peace. It is difficult to conduct a war against the enemy that does not share our ethics. There is no basic ethics. So it's difficult to conduct a warfare against this enemy and this kind of pseudo-democratic society. The Chinese were not mistaken when they raised this question that Europe is quite a moral society. We have been offended by Putin, by the Islamists, that this is a decaying society. But we should not allow ourselves to say that morality is relevant. There is always their ethics, and it's European ethics, and it has to be supported, and we have to reassess and reconsider it all the time.
Yeah, well, my comment is that solidarities don't, on their own, sustain themselves without, in the long term. For the short term, they undoubtedly can sustain themselves, but in the long term, they will need to have material foundations so that will
Je vous en prie. J'arrive pas à entendre ce qu'il dit non plus, c'est pas grave. Merci. Merci pour votre travail de traduction, hein. Magnifique.
Of the European Union, and I think the European Union has reached a point at which new questions have to be posed and answers to those questions have to be found for its continuation. The current crisis of the European Union, and I think it is in a kind of a crisis, in a way has been precisely because the objectives that were set a long time ago have in fact actually been realized, and new objectives, new goals have to be set, and the institutional structures have to be put in place to realize those.
Дякую усім панелістам, дякую професору Грицаку, дякую професору.
I'm grateful to all the panelists, to Professor Delanty, to Professor HRYTSAK, to Professor Olivier Abel, to all those who were present with us, both online and offline. Please follow the program, and we shall meet again on other discussions. Thank you.
Раз. Один.
Recording stopped.
Оу.
Так, ніби по програмі.
Раз. Раз. Один. О. Один. Раз. Раз. 11. Раз. 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 Раз.